So today's daf in Masechet Menachot is Nun Vav 56, and we're up to 4 lines from the bottom of Nun Hey Amud Bet. So the second of the wide lines. Just remember, you don't really need to know yesterday's daf for today. That's the good news. But we had a big discussion yesterday about prat and klal, right? Basically, the Torah tells you do something general, like don't make your mincha chametz, and then it says don't bake your mincha if it's chametz. And so, is that telling you only baking, even baking, including baking? So we had a whole discussion about whether it's a klal or prat, right? That the rule is don't do it for everything, but then it says only don't do it for one thing, so it limits it to that one thing. Or is it a davar hayotzei min haklal, right? Where you have a rule and then you have an exception and you use that to learn back about the whole rule, and that's what we did for mincha. That afiyah maaseh yichidi, that baking it is a singular action, meaning it can be done by one person in one big thing. So to all other maaseh yichidi would be chayev. So we tried to then learn about this whole question of klal prat from the question of where it says to shecht the karban of a nasi. Right, so the Nasi brought a karban that was a one-time karban just on the day of Chanukah, the day they made the Mishkan, right? We're coming up. Rosh Chodesh Nisan is the day, right? So it's coming up soon. Every Nasi did one day. Nachshon ben Aminadav did the first day, on and on and on. They did the next 12 days, 11 days. And by the chatat of the Nasi, it says, Shachat oto b'makom asher yishchat hola. Shecht it where you check the ola, lifnei Hashem. So we said, well, that's only this chatat. What about every other chatat? Anyways, the end of the Gemara yesterday was that we're not actually learning it from a klal prad or anything like that. It's from the fact that it says v'shachat oto, shecht it. It is a very specific limitation. It doesn't say shecht in the north, just shecht it. And we would have thought that meant it's the only karban that needs to be in the north, the only karban chatat. Kamash Malan, there's a third pasuk yesterday that all karban chatat needs to be done in the north. And so now today's Gemara, well, I'm going to start from the fifth line from the bottom. Hashta denafkalem v'shachat chatat. Now that we learned from the third pasuk of a shachat chatat that every karban chatat has to be done in the north, oto lemute mai. So why does it say mechatot of a nasi? We call it chatat nachshon because he was the first nasi. Why do we say by chatat nasi shecht it? What are you telling me to do it and not something else? Lemute mai, right? Says the Gemara lemute. Third line from the bottom, that oto b'tzafon ve'ein seir nachshon b'tzafon. Sorry, I said it the opposite way. I kept saying nachshon. It meaning it, the karban of the nasi, right, should be done in the tzafon, right? The karban of the nasi. I made a mistake. I got ahead of myself. Good. Now Miriam's joining. The pasuk that we have of a shachat oto is referring to the Seir Nasi, not of the Seir Nasi of Nachshon, sorry. It's referring to the Seir Nasi when he does a chet, right? So when the Nasi does a sin, remember, if the tzibor does a sin, we do a parhel and davar shel tzibor. If the tzibor does it, if the Nasi, sorry, the president, or whatever you call the Nasi, does a sin, he brings a karban Sa'ir, Nasi, that has to be done in the north. The chiddush of that, we're 3 lines from the bottom of Daf Nun Hey Amud Bet. The chiddush is Oto b'tzafon ve'ein Seir Nachshon b'tzafon. I said mistakenly, the Seir of Nachshon, which is the Seir done on the first day of Nisan, right? The Seir done for the Chanukat HaMishkan, and every Nasi brought a karban every day. That does not have to be done in the north because that's done as a Chanukah, not really as a regular chatat, right? Because I would have thought, no, why would I have thought it has to be done in the north? Because I would have thought, Rabi Linyan Smicha, Rabi Namin Safon. Since we're going to discuss this in a minute, that you have to do smicha on the sa'ir of Nachshon, which again is a description of the sa'ir of the Nisi'im for the Chanukat HaMishkan, since you have to lean on the animal, which is a special halacha of karbanot, since it's added for that halacha, you might think it's also added for halacha that has to be done in the north. Kamash Malan, that it doesn't need to be done in the north. That the only karban of the nasi that has to be done in the north is the nasi's karban for a sin, but the chatat of a nachshon, the seir nachshon, does not need to be done in the north. Ask the Gemara 2 lines from the bottom, the smicha gufa minalan. Now, how do I know that it has to have smicha? Right? Because you're saying just like it has to have smicha, you would have thought it has to be done in the north. How do you know it has to have smicha? Titania. And that's from the following Braita. It says, V'samach yado al rosh ha'sa'ir, right? It says this is in general. You should put your hands on top of the sa'ir, referring to the sa'ir of the nasi, the same sa'ir that's brought for a sin, for for avera. Says the Braita, the Rabot Seir Nachshon Smicha. That actually includes that not only this carbon of the Nasi needs to have smicha, but even the Seir done by the Nesiim for the Chanukat Mishkan, they also need smicha. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, turn to Daf Nun Vav Amud Aleph, top line, the Rabot Sirei Avodat Kochavim L'smicha. No, it's telling you that if you bring a Seir for Avodah Zarah, a Seir for a mistake, right, for a sin of Avodah Zarah, you have to do smicha. So not Seir Nachshon. So Matkif Ravina, so asked Ravina, your whole point was that you would have included saying that a Sa'ir Nachshon has to be done in the north because it has to have smicha. But it's a machloket Tanaim. So Teinach, the Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says you need smicha, so I get that you might have thought you need smicha, you also need to do it in the north. But Rabbi Shimon, but what about Rabbi Shimon? According to Rabbi Shimon, you don't need to do smicha on the Sa'ir Nachshon, so you wouldn't have to think you do it in the north. So why do you have a pasuk to tell me that you don't do it in the north? I would have never thought you do it in the north. Says Marzutra, Breder of Mari, the Ravina. Amarli Marzutra, Breder of Mari, the Ravina. I still don't think it's a. I mean, you're right. It's a problem because Rabbi Shimon does not hold smicha. So why would he hold north? But even Rabbi Yehuda Nami, Rabbi Yehuda says you need smicha. But so what? Why would that tell me that because you need smicha, you need to shecht it in the north? Why don't you say my di it's Rabbi, my di lo it's Rabbi, lo it's Rabbi. For the thing that it's mitrabeh, the thing that the Torah said do it, like smicha, for according to Rabbi Yehuda, do that. But what the Torah didn't say, you don't have to do, right? So, meaning, why would you assume that just because a karban needs one extra, it needs another extra? So this does not seem to be um, a very good reason why you would need a pasuk to exclude doing it in the north. The chitemina, you might say, 6 lines on the top, that ilo ma'atekra, if the Torah didn't say, again, the fundamental issue here is the Torah says by a sa'ir nasi, shecht it, shachat oto, right? B'makom asher tishchat ta'olah, shecht it in the north, makom kodesh, and we learn from there only it, but there's another karban that does not to be done in the north, and we're saying that karban is the sa'ir of Nachshon or the Nesiim on the day of Chanukat Mishkan, which is not really done for a sin; it's just done as a Chanukah, and therefore you don't have to do it in the north. The Torah is telling you that. We're asking why would I have thought you would need it in the north? So Fred, maybe because of smicha, but we didn't like that answer. So maybe you'll say now that ilomate kra, if the Torah didn't exclude the Sa'ir Nachshon from smicha, have I would have thought, take to me binyanav. I would have thought that you learn it from what's called a binyan av. Binyan av means you learn from one thing. The Torah says do one thing, do it by another thing, right? So binyan av is you learn from the paradigm about the other thing. So you might have said you learn from binyan av that the Torah is basically saying that just like this is all Rashi seems to say it, other carbonot chatat need to be in the north. This needs to be in the north. But if that's true that there's a binyan av that just like other carbonot chatat need to be in the north, then why don't you say the same binyan av for smicha, saying other carbonot chatat needs smicha, so Sa'ir Nachshon needs smicha also. So smicha gufa, if that was the way you were going to learn it, then smicha itself lishtak kra minei v'teti binyan av. Let the Torah not tell me you need smicha, and I'll learn it's like a karban chatat. Ella, clearly, you can't learn a karban of the Nisi'im at the time of Chanukah Mishkan from every other karban that's a regular karban. And the principle we say is Sha'a midorot al yalfinan. A karban that was done Sha'a, a one-time episode, or a Chanukah episode, midorot, from something that's a forever karban, a karban chatat that you bring for a sin or for whatever, lo yalfinan. You don't derive one from the other. And hachanami shamidarot lo yalfinan. Here too, there's no reason why you would have assumed that the sa'ir nachshom needs to be done in the north. You don't really need to assume it's going to have smicha, and therefore you can't say that the pasuk of sa'ir nasi is excluding sa'ir nachshon. So that's clearly not the answer. Ella, let's come up with answer number two. Answer number two is that oto to'un safon. The Torah is saying that the Seir Nasi, needs to be shechted in the north, but only the shechita has to happen in the north. The shochet does not have to be in the north. I mean, you could be standing in the south of or the bottom part, I guess we call it bottom, but the south part of the Mishkan, and the knife has to be with the animal in the north, and that's where the shechita, you don't actually have to be, the shochet doesn't have to be in the north, only the animal. Eina shochet omed b'tzafon, that the shochet does not to be need to be in the north. So you always probably wondered when we say the north, do you have to be in the north? The answer, according to this, is you don't. You just have the animal has to be in the north. Says Gemara, that's very nice, but we already know that. Mid Rabbi Yachia nafka. We already learned that from Rabbi Yachia. The Tanya Rabbi Yachia Omer. It says different pasuk, of course. V'shachad oto by the Ola. V'shachad oto al yerech hamizbeach tzafona. It says shechted on the yerech hamizbeach. Matam alomer. What is oto? Right. It says the word oto in this pasuk as well. Shech it, the carbon ola al yerech hamizbeach. Why do you say oto? Because look, we find by the person who accepts the blood that the person who accepts the blood has to be omeid b'tzafon and mikabel b'tzafon. They have to be standing in the north and accept the blood in a cup in the north. Vim amad b'darom v'kibel b'tzafon pasul. If they were standing in the south side of the Mishkan and reached their hands out and accepted the blood in the north, it would be pasul. We learn that from elsewhere. So Yachav Zekain says the Braita, you might think the same thing is true about the Shechita. That just like by Kabbalah, you have to be in the north to accept the blood. By Shechita, maybe you have to be in the north to shech the animal. Talmulomar Oto. Therefore, it says by the Ola, it has to be done in the north. Oto b'tzafon, v'la shochet tzarech liot omei b'tzafon. The shochet does not need to be in the tzafon. So thank you very much, but you don't need to tell me that about Sa'ir Nasi. I already learned it from an Ola. An Ola, of course, is the paradigm of Shechita in the north. So this is a true halacha, but it's well established. So, okay, so we're back to our original problem. Why does it say Mishachat Oto in by the Sa'ir Nasi? Says the Braita, what it's telling you, says more, sorry. The third answer is Oto b'tzafon, the Ein ben Of b'tzafon. The whole point of the pasuk is to tell you this karban, this animal, needs to be done in the north, but birds don't need to be shechted in the north. Now, we haven't talked about doing malika on birds where they are. Because I would have thought logically from learning Zvachim that leiti b'kal v'chomer in benson, that you learn a bird, a ben oaf, right, from a kal v'chomer, from a sheep, from a benson, from an animal. What's the kal v'chomer? Ma benson shelo kavalo kohen. Right. Remember, a benson, a shchita of an animal, does not need to be done by a kohen. A zar can do shchita of most karbanot. Right. So just like a benson is not needed to be a kohen, but it does have to be in the north, kavalo tzafon. So ben of shekavalo kohen. Remember that a bird has malika, and the malika can only be done by a kohen. So since the actual act requires a kohen, enodin shnek valo tzafon. So for sure, it should have to be done in the north. So that's a kal v'chomer. It's a more chomer thing. It has to have a kohen. Presumably, if the more kal thing has to be done in the north, the more chomer thing has to be done in the north. That's not, you're making it sound like one issue is the whole thing. But there's a lot of other differences between the tzon, between animals and birds, and some are stricter about animals. Because mala ben tzon, look, think about the animals, she'ein king kavalo kli. You recall, you have to have a kli in order to shecht the animal, right? There's no way to shecht an animal without a knife. But a bird, you use your finger, right? So in some ways now you could say shechting an animal is more strict because you need to own an apparatus. And therefore, it's true, you don't need a kohen, you need a kli, but you can't make a kal v'chomer from a animal to a bird. And therefore, I would have never thought that a bird needs to be done in the north. The Torah never says it. So why do you need a pasuk to exclude it if you never would have thought of it? Ella says the Gemara, the fourth answer, and I think the final answer is Oto b'tzafon. The chiddush here is it is done in the north. The Ein Pesach b'tzafon. The chiddush, thankfully, we're coming up to Pesach, right? Is that the carbon Sa'ir Nasi has to be done in the north, like every other carbon Chatat and Ola, but a carbon Pesach doesn't have to be done in the north, which is very convenient. Because if you recall, they did thousands of carbon Pesach on Erev Pesach, and if everyone had to be in the north, you'd only have half the space to do it, right? So thankfully, they were able to use the whole Azara, right? And the Chiddush is that Oto b'tzafon ein Pesach b'tzafon. Says more, but we already know that. Thanks to the good point. But Pesach made Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov nafka. We already learned Pesach from the Braita of Rabbi Elazar ben Nafka. Titania, what is the Braita? Titania, Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov Omer. Sorry, Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov says, Yachol yehi Pesach ta'un tzafon. Says Rav Elazar ben Yaakov, the Torah doesn't tell me where to shech the Karban Pesach, right? Of course, in Mitzrayim, they shechted the Karban Pesach anywhere, but that was different. But the Torah doesn't tell me where to shech the Karban Pesach in the time that there's a Beit HaMikdash. V'dinu. Now, I have a logical conclusion based on analysis of the halachot. Because think about it this way. Ma'ola, Karban Ola in general, she'ein kavala zman b'shchitata, right? Ola, you can do an Ola whenever, meaning most Olot, almost all Olot, except for the public ones, you bring them as a gift. So you can decide on Tuesday or Wednesday or next Monday, you want to bring an Ola. So it's not such a fixed thing, but Cavallo Tzafon, but the place is fixed. So although the time of the Ola could be any time, it has to be done in the north. So Pesach, now you get to a Karban Pesach, which is very limited. You can only do a Karban Pesach on Erev Pesach. Shekavalo zman l'shchitato. There's a very specific fixed time that you can check the Karban Pesach, namely Erev Pesach. Eino din shekavalo tzafon. So too, for sure, it should be kavalo tzafon. Now you could imagine, hopefully, that this is the kind of limud you do, but it's very you know, you would fail in debate, right? Because you're basically taking one fact about a Karban Pesach that it's a fixed time, and you're making it as if it's more Chomer than a Karban Ola, right? Which in one way it is. But of course, there's many, many other halachot about a Karban Ola that are different than a Karban Pesach. And the Gemara immediately says, Mala Ola Shkin Kalil. What do you mean? There's no comparison. You can't say that a Pesach is a stricter, a more kodesh, a more limited karban than a ola because it has to be done on the 14th of Nisan. The ola is burned completely on the mizbeach. The Pesach, you eat the whole thing pretty much, right? So clearly there's some stringencies in one over the other, but there's some the other way too. And you can't make a general principle and say, oh, Pesach is more strict than Ola, and therefore everything that applies by Ola has to apply by Pesach. Clearly, that's not true. So Ola is not a limit. Says more, okay, what about mechatat? Right? A chatat is the same issue, right? A karban chatat is brought whenever you need to bring a karban chatat. If you sin, you bring a karban chatat next week. And so it doesn't have a fixed time. And a Pesach has a fixed time, so a Pesach should be more strict. Again, it's true, but there's many other issues about chatat. For example, mal chatat shkim mechaper chayvei kritut, right? A chatat comes to give a kapara for Isser of Karet. Pesach doesn't do anything for you in that sense. It doesn't mechaper on anything, right? So again, you can't just say that because something is true by a chatat, it has to be true by a Pesach. It says, well, okay, what about me asham? Karban asham, right? And asham is, again, you bring it whenever you want. You don't have a fixed time. A Pesach has a fixed time. An asham is done in the north. Maybe a Pesach should be done in the north. And again, answers the Gemara, but a asham is kachi kadashim, right? Mala asham shekin kachi kadashim and has all the requirements of kachi kadashim about eating it and things like that, right? So you can't learn Pesach from asham. Says the Gemara, well, what about all of them, right? So we always do this. What's matzah shava, right? Take an ola. Well, an ola is kalil. Take a chatat. Well, it's brun for karet. Take an asham. Says more, but it's true. But if you put all of them together, mi kulu nami shikin kache kadashim, right? All, and this, of course, we learned in Zvachim, all of the karbanot that you bring in the north, for the most part, are ola, chatas, asham, are all kache kadashim. A karban pesach is kachim kalim, right? And so, therefore, why would I have thought that a karban pesach needs to be done in the north for a pasuk to come and say you don't need to do it in the north? It says, well, you're right. None of these answers are satisfactory. Elul olam. Let's go back to an earlier answer, right? The earlier answer we had was Amina Meikar. We said an earlier answer today that the pasuk says shecht it in the north, oto b'tzafon, to tell you ein hashochet b'tzafon, but the person doing the shechita doesn't have to be in the north. We said that's a great answer, but if you recall earlier today, we said that we had a braita of Rabbi Achia who already learned that from a different pasuk by the Ola. With Rabbi Achia nafka, a question we had earlier on that answer was why don't we derive it from Rabbi Achia? Says Gemara, well, Rabbi Achia is telling you, Rabbi Achia lav the muti shochet b'tzafon da'ata. Rabbi Achia is not telling you that a shochet b'tzafon is allowed, is permitted. Elahachi kamer, right? What Rabbi Achia is telling you basically is that ena shochet b'tzafon. The shochet does not have to be in the north. Avo mikabel b'tzafon. The chiddush of Rabbi Achia is that not. Remember, we read Rabbi Achia earlier and thought he was saying This by Kabbalat Adam, you need to be standing in the north, but by Shechita, you don't need to be standing in the north. That's not what Rabbi Yechia was telling us. Rabbi Yechia was actually saying by Shechita, you don't need to be in the north. No, he wasn't telling you the source of that, and we're saying the source of that is that b'shachar oto. The animal needs to be in the north, but not the shochet. And Rabbi Yechia was coming to tell you, but the mikabel has to be in the north. Avo mikabel b'tzafon, right? Says the Gemara, but I skipped this earlier because we were going to get to it now. But mikabel, we already know the mikabel is to be in the north, which is why we assumed that Rabbi Yechia was taking that for granted because it says lakach with a vav. It says lakach vilakach nafka. So it says the extra vav by vilakach, and we assume that means that you take it, meaning you have to also have done the previous step in the north. And it's lakach vilakach no mashmalei. That's really what it boils down to. That extra vav, according to this Tana, did not imply to him that you need to accept the blood in the north. And therefore, Rabbi Yechia brought a pasuk to tell you that you have to do that. But Rabbi Yechia was not telling you about the shechita. And the shechita does not, the shochet, sorry, does not have to stand in the north. And we learned that from the pasuk of Vishachat Oto, that you shecht it, meaning the animal has to be in the north, Al Yercha Mizbeach Tzafona, but the shochet could be standing, 2 feet away, or it's hard to shecht from 2 feet away, but I guess 6 inches away in the south of the Azara and do the shechita. And so that is what we learned from that pasuk, and we conclude I'd say yesterday's daf almost good, yesterday's sugya. And we are now up to, where are we up to? Around 10 lines on the bottom at the two dots. So back to our Mishnah, right? Our Mishnah again, and you wonder how we get off topic in the Gemara, but our Mishnah is about how you're not allowed to have chametz when you do the carbon mincha, and any process that's chametz, right? So meaning even if it's already chametz and you do the next step, you bake it, when it's chametz, you're also chayav an isser of having chametz for your mincha, right? So that's what the Mishnah said. Chayav al lishata, val arichata, val afiata. You're chayav for the kneading of the dough, for the aricha is the shaping of the dough, and you're chayav for the baking of the dough. Amar of Papa. Now says Rav Papa, just want to point out, if you bake something, in general, lokesh time, you get and it's chametz, it's a mincha, you get makot twice, because baking something, this is a little complicated, but I'm going to try to simplify it. But baking it basically is a process that also involves shaping it. Meaning it's impossible to bake something, not impossible, but it's unlikely to bake something without also shaping it. Because as you, I guess, pick it up and put it in the oven and put it against the wall of the oven or however they usually bake things, you're also forming it in that process. So the act of baking is essentially two acts. Achat al arichata, it's shaping it, v'achat al afiata, and also it is baking it. Says the Gemara, but that contradicts our whole point of baking it. Because we said yesterday, Amrit, ma'afia miuchedet, we said, remember, the Torah says don't do it b'chametz, and it says don't bake it b'chametz. And we said baking it teaches you about everything else, that just like baking it, ma'afia miuchedet, she maseh yichidi, that afia is a singular action. The chayav and labif ne'atzma, you're chayav for it on its own. But now you're coming and telling me that baking it is not a singular action. That every baking it involves two actions. So it almost contradicts your primary limud. Lakasha says, well, there's different ways to bake, basically. Had arahu va'afahu, right? It's true. If you're the one, again, a lot of debate about how to read this in Girsa, but I'm going to read what we have. If you're the one shaping it and baking it, you basically, in the act of baking it, you reshape it, you reform it, right? Sorry, well, you could say it either way, but I'm going to say it this way: that if you formed it, sorry, this opposite way, right? That basically, if you're the person who did the aricha, that is your act of aricha. When you then go to bake it, you're doing a separate act of baking it. We don't consider that chayiv makos twice for the baking it, because we're basically already giving you makot for the aricha. We consider that your full action. But if somebody else shaped it, and then gave it to you to bake it, so there we assume that when you took it from someone, and this is like when you bake matzah, you think of it this way, you basically finished shaping it. So although they shaped it originally, they gave it to you and you did more to it. And so that's in the case where if you then bake it, you're chayiv twice for baking it and shaping it, because the action of you baking it is also an action of shaping it. And that's why it's considered to be a combined action. So that's one explanation. There's others, pshatim, about what's going on here, as you can imagine. Tanu Rabbanan. Now says the Gemara, let's get into this issue. This is a beautiful it's not going to finish it today either, exposition of this whole question of can you do an act after another act, right? So the whole idea of chametz is that the dough was already chametz, right? You made a chametz because you were negligent when you were doing the lisha, you added saor, you added sourdough, you let it rise basically. If you then take the same dough and while it's chametz, bake it, you're chayiv a second time, right? But it already is chametz. What are you doing? You're not making it more chametz, right? So says the Braita, Bechor, Tanrabanan. Let's say you have a Bechor. This is a preparation for Masechta Bechorot, which we'll have in around 6 months, I guess, more than that. A Bechor she'achazot dam. Remember, one of the things that principles about a Bechor is you're not allowed to make a mum in a Bechor. It's a very big deal because a Bechor that is a tamim is supposed to be brought on the Mizbeach. If a Bechor gets a mum, then all of a sudden you don't have to bring it on the Mizbeach, you can just eat it, right? The coin. So of course, you're not allowed to make a mum in a Bechor. It's supposed to be a carbon. But let's say you have a Bechor she'achazot dam. A Bechor got stricken by blood. That's what I guess what the words literally mean. But it gets some kind of condition that it's overheating, it has too much blood, and back in those days, and maybe even today, I don't know much about veterinary medicine, they would bloodlet, right? They would make a hole in a vein and let the blood draw out, and I guess that would help reduce whatever infection or fever or whatever was going on. But the problem, of course, is that making a hole in a vein is making a mum essentially, or almost making a mum in an animal. So what do you do? So says the Braita, Bechor shachazot dam. If you have a Bechor whose blood is tightened up, meaning it can't, whatever, it's a mum, and it's not a mum, but it can't be brought on the Mizbeach. Makizin oto et adam, you're allowed to bloodlet it, but only b'makom she'eno sim bo mum. Right, but you have to do it in a place which wouldn't cause a permanent wound. So it has to be a very small incision or incision in a big blood vessel where you're not actually cutting through the skin in order to get there. So it has to be something that's a very small act. But you can't do bloodletting on this animal if it's going to make a mum through the action. That's Rabbi Meir's opinion. You can do it, but not if it's going to cause a mum. The Chachamim say no problem. Yakiz, you're allowed to take blood from the animal, do bloodletting, af makom she'osim bo mum, even in a place where it's going to make a mum. However, you're not bavachli yishchat al oto mum. You're not allowed to do shchita based on that mum. Meaning, you can't then say, oh, look, yesterday I did bloodletting on the animal. I had to go into the femoral vein, so I had to cut into the leg and get it open and do it. And now, look, my animal has a mum, so I no longer have to bring it as a korban. That's like a trick, right? You're not allowed to do that. So you're allowed to make the mum, but you can't use that mum basically for shechita. Rabbi Shimon says, turn to daf nun vav amabed, af nishchata oto mum. Says Rabbi Shimon, no, you're allowed to do it because we allow you to do things to help this animal who is in need. And then once you've done it, it's done. So you can shecht because there's a mum. That's the reality. And Rabbi Yehuda says, forget about all of this, right? Afilu mate, even if the animal is going to die because it's sick, kizin lo et adam. You're not allowed to do it at all. Not even Rabbi Meir's opinion that you can do it in a way that doesn't cause a mum. Don't touch this animal and start doing things medically with it, partly because we worry about xera, because we're afraid you're going to start making it mutter. People are going to look at it and say, oh, you're allowed to do procedures for a Bechor, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda says it's aser. Okay, so that is the Braita. Now, about this Braita, says Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Rabbi Yochanan, Hakol chometz, everybody agrees when you start thinking about doing one thing after the other, that if you do chimutz, you do leavening of a mincha, when it's already been leavened, you're chayav again for an isser of not making chametz. Dichtiv, and that's based on the psukim. The pasuk says lo te'aseh chametz by a mincha, and it says lo te'afeh chametz. And we learned yesterday and probably 2 days ago, I don't remember, that means that every act of the mincha that's done b'chimutz is chayav. So even if you did the first act, lisha b'chimutz, and then you did the afiyah b'chimutz, you'd be chayav twice. So that's given based on the Torah. Misares achar misares. Now, another thing, the Torah says don't castrate an animal, right? Castration usually involves doing something to the animal's testicles. Now, if you recall from the psukim, there's a lot of different things you can do. We're going to quote it in a second. You can cut them off, you can cut the seminal vesicles that connect to them, you can crush the testicles so they're not functional anymore. What if you do one act and then you do another act that does the same effect, that makes the animal unable to conceive? Shu chayav, you're chayav for the second act, even though it's already been done. Dichtiv, because the pasuk says, this is the pasuk, ma'uch v'katut v'natuk v'karut, right? And we translate usually ma'uch as being bruised, is how I see it translated, which I guess means damaged. Katut means literally means crushed. Natuk means it's taken off. It's natuk. It's unattached, and karut means like you're correct. You cut it off, right? Now Rashi understands usually that karut means you don't cut out the testicle, but you cut the vessel that connects to it, right? So says the Braita, says the Gemara, sorry, im al koretu chayav. If you're chayav for um, cutting the connection, I'll notek lo kol shekain. For notek, which we think means actually taking the whole thing off, you're for sure chayav, right? Because if you cut it, you're chayav, but if you remove it, you're for sure chayav. Ella, what the Torah is telling you is that if you do both, lahavim notek achar korei shu chayav, right? That if you first cut the seminal vesicle, so that the animal's essentially castrated, and then you remove the testicle, you're chayav for the second act. So sirus achar sirus is chayav and chimutz achar chimutz is chayiv. The question of this braita that we just quoted is, what about making a mum in a bechar? Lo nechleku ela b'matil mum b'bal mum. The question is, if you put a mum in a bal mum, Rabbi Meir savar kol mum lo yebo. Rabbi Meir says you can't make a mum in the animal because it says any mum should not be in the animal, right? And that's a very, very specific inclusion that even if it already has a mum, you can't make another mum in that animal. And so take this animal now. This animal is very sick, right? It already has a mum. It's a natural mum, right? Because it's makiz, it's a chazodam. Say the Rabbanan, you can go and fix that animal by making another mum. Why? Because it already has a mum. So what's the big deal? And Rabbi Meir says, no, even though it already has a mum, you can't add a second mum to that bechor because the pasuk says, kol mum lo yebo. It cannot have a mum, which includes you cannot make a mum even if it already has a mum. Rabbanan say, no, that's not what the pasuk means. The pasuk says tamim yiyeh l'ratzon. The carbon bechor, not the carbon, the bechor has to be tamim. It has to be complete. Once this animal is not complete, it has a mum, which again happened naturally. It's a chazodam. You can make another mum to fix it, essentially. So the Rabbanan are not bothered by making one mum after another mum in a bechor. Ask the Gemara, what does each person do with the other person's pasuk? Rabbi Meir nam yachtiv tamim niyeh l'ratzon. Rabbi Meir, what about the Chachamim's pasuk that says that it has to be tamim? This animal is not tamim. That's referring to an animal that essentially was born with a mum. Let's say the animal was born defective. So there, Rabbi Meir admits that because it was born with a mum, if you make another mum in that animal, you're not chayiv. But this animal was born healthy and was lived healthy and developed a mum later. And there, Rabbi Meir says you're not allowed to make a second mum. Ask the Gemara, Bal mum meikar, dikla balmu. Why would a bal mum meikar need a pasuk? If an animal is born with a mum, then basically it never became a bechor, right? I mean, it was born as a bechor, but never was kedusha of a bechor because it was born. Tikla means a tree, right? But I mean, it's not that it's not an animal, but you don't treat it like an animal. Ella, what reason Rabbi Meir doesn't darshan the pasuk that the Chachamim say is lemute psulei muktashim la'achar pidyonam. Rabbi Meir understands this pasuk to be referring to something completely different, which is if you have a carbon, right? Let's say you dedicate a carbon chatat, right? Let's just pick an example, and the animal becomes puzzle, right? It becomes puzzle in some way, and then you redeem it, right? Because it's no longer able to be brought as a carbon. It's not kedushat haguf. It's to remember, like every chatat that we talk. Well, chatat's not a good example. Every ola, let's say, we say yireh yista'ev, right? Let it graze until it gets a mum, and then you can redeem it and use the money for hektish, right? So in that situation, I would have thought that whole v'asir b'gizav avodah, that since you're not allowed to use the giza, the shearings of such an animal, you're not allowed to use that animal to work for you in the Beit HaMikdash, in your regular avodah, right? Until you redeem it, right? Sorry, even after you, right? Because remember, there's a separate halacha that even after you're podeh that animal, you're allowed to shecht it and eat it, but you're not allowed to use it for regular activities because people will be mizalzel b'kachim. So I would have thought b'mumam nami litzari that you're also not allowed to make a mum in that animal. So if you have a psulei muktashim that you were podeh, you're not allowed to make a mum in it because it still has some level of kedusha. Kamashmalan, that's not true. That's only by a bechor that you have to worry about that. So that's what the pasuk of Tamim Niyah tells you according to uh, Rabbi Meir. V'Rabbanan nami hachtiv kol mum yebo. What about the Rabbanan? The Rabbanan say that if an animal bechor has a mum, if it got sick, you can then be mekizdam. You can, sorry, you can bloodlet, right? You can make a hole in the animal and pull out blood, even if you're going to make a mum doing that action, because it already has a mum. So there's no problem of making a second mum. What about the pasuk that Rabbi Meir quoted? Hachtiv kol mum yo yabo. Pasuk says, don't make a mum, implying even if there already is one. So what does he do with that? What do they do with that pasuk? Says the Gemara, Humi Boile, they use that pasuk likiditanya. They use it for the following brayta. Where am I up to? We are, I guess, 8 lines from the bottom, right? Says the Gemara kiditanya. As the brayta says, sorry, keep losing my place here. As the brayta says, v'chol mum lo yebo, right? This is, of course, Rabbi Meir's pasuk. It says by a bechor, don't put any mum in the animal. Ainli elish lo yehebo mum. All that tells me, says the Braita, is that you're not allowed to make a mum. You can't go and wound the animal in a way that causes a mum. But how do I know that you can't indirectly cause a mum? How would you indirectly cause a mum or have someone else do it? Oldest trick in the book, right? You put a little bit of bread, a batsik is a dough, right? A nice cookie, or a dvela or a fig, right? The pressed figs that they have, attach it to the ear of the animal, right? Al gabe ozen, on its ear. Kadesh yeheh kelef yitzlenu. A dog will come and bite the ear because it wants this beautiful treat, this cookie, and then the animal will have a mum. So you didn't give it a mum. You very indirectly caused it to have a mum. How do you know that that is not permitted? Talmud Omer kol mum. Therefore, it says kol mum, right? Where am I? Here we go. There it says, thank you. Kol mum, and that, and actually, therefore it says kol mum, amar mum, v'amar kol mum. Yeah, this girsa, sorry, this is why I'm confused here. In the Gemara Bechor, it doesn't have the next words, but this seems to just be saying what word darsha. It could have said mum. It says kol mum to tell you that not only can you not make a mum, but you can't indirectly make a mum. So it says mum, the kol mum, and that's what we learn from the pasuk of kol mum lo yiyabo, and therefore there is no pasuk according to the Chachamim to tell you that you are not allowed to make a mum achar another mum, after another mum. And therefore, unlike mincha, where the Torah very clearly says, don't do chimutz if it's already been chimutz, and not like sirus, where the Torah says that, by other things, for example, bal mum, in a bechor, if it already has a mum, according to the chachamim, you can actively make another mum, mainly to save the life of the animal, that you're allowed to do it, and then as a consequence of that, according to the chachamim, you can't then shecht it, a takana, but according to Rabbi Shimon, it's not even a problem. Since you're allowed to make the second mum, once it has the second mum, you can say, it's time to shech the animal. So that's a very interesting halacha. Let's do just a few more lines. And we have 4 more minutes, I think. Says the Gemara, 4 lines from the bottom. Amar Rabbi Ami, there's a lot of ways to make dough chametz, right? You can do it actively by adding ingredients and mixing them together. I clearly don't know much about dough, but by mixing them together and causing it to become chametz. But you can also just leave it there. Let's say, says Rabbi Ami, haniach sa'ar agabe isa v'halachilo. Right? Let's say you leave your dough out and you put a little bit of sourdough on top of it, right? And you let the magic happen on its own. You go away, you go to lunch, the yashavlo, and you let it sit. When it becomes chametz on its own, right? Well, what do you know? The sourdough causes it to become chametz. Says Rabbi Ami, you're chayav aleh. Don't make it sound like it was passive. What can I do? I just left it there. You are chayav. Kimaseh Shabbat. Right? It's just like Shabbat. It's like if you did something similar on Shabbat, you would also be chayiv. Just like you'd be chayiv on Shabbat. Rashi says, just like if you leave meat on the coals on Shabbat and you come back 30 minutes later, you're like, oh my gosh, my meat got cooked. What do you know? So you're chayiv. That's what cooking is, right? You didn't actively cook it. You just put it on the coals. But that's considered to be chayav on Shabbat. And that would be chayav by chametz of the mincha, right? Ask the Gemara, is that true? Umaseh Shabbat ki agafnim chayiv. Are you chayiv on Shabbat if you just leave food on the coals and you don't do anything to actually actively cook it? Va'amar Rabbi bar Rechana, Amar Rabbi. Yochanan, probably. Yeah. Says Rabbi Rechana, says Rabbi Yochanan on the top of Daf Nun Zayin Amud Aleph. He said, "Heniach basar gabei gichalim." If you put your meat on Shabbat on the coals, hipech bo chayav, lo hipech bo patur. If you turn it over, which means you enhance the cooking of the action of the food, then you are chayav, right? But if you don't turn it over, you'd be patur. So you actually see that by Shabbat, if you have no physical contribution, you would be patur. Amar Rava, says Rava, and this is really tomorrow's sugya, but I'm going to do just the first line. Says Rava, no. When we say chayav, to Amar, kemaset sli on Shabbat, we're talking about a case of roasting on Shabbat. As we're going to see, right, when we get to tomorrow, that obviously it depends on what you're doing to cook the thing. If you're roasting something, right, meaning that when you roast something, basically that's how you roast it, right? You put it on the coals and you let it cook. That's the act of cooking. So too, the soar is that act. I'm going to see, as we get to it a little bit tomorrow, that of course there are things that won't cook unless you actually move them around, right? And if there are things that you have to be involved in order for it to cook, and you aren't involved in it, then you might be patur in Shabbat because you're actually not doing the cooking. But there are certainly some acts of cooking which you just place them down and they cook, right? And therefore, putting se'or on flour and water is a similar thing, and you would be chayav for chametz just by doing that act. Again, we'll get to tomorrow. Will be a continued discussion about exactly what are you doing on Shabbos that you're chayav, what are you doing on Shabbos that you're pater, and what kind of cooking. So that will continue tomorrow. And thank you for joining early this morning. Shavua Tova. Whew. Hope to be back in New York in a little bit.
Shavua Tov. Where are you? San Francisco?
I'm in Los Angeles,
Los
actually.
Angeles. Say hi to Talia for me.
I have not left my hotel, and I'm only going to leave it now to go back to the airport. So
Oh, wow. Safe travels.
thank you. We'll see you Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov.
Bye.